prince secretly follows poor peasant home. His discovery left him speechless. A restless prince walks out of his glittering castle into the frozen night. The snow crunches under his boots, and in the shadows, he spies a poor peasant girl, her arms full of firewood, her breath heavy, yet her eyes unbroken. He follows her to a crooked cottage, and through a crack in the wall, he witnesses something no court has ever shown him. A sister giving up her last piece of bread, whispering prayers for her sick brother, starving herself so that he might live. But the prince's secret is not safe. A jealous noblewoman watches, ready to turn sacrifice into scandal. And the crown itself may crush the girl he cannot forget. Chains in the dungeon, whispers in the chapel, a feast where a single glance could start a war. What will a prince risk when nobility is not in birth, but in love? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The great hall blazed with 100 beeswax candles, their light dancing off golden platters and crystal goblets. Prince Leopold sat rigid in his carved wooden chair, picking at the feast before him without appetite. Around him, the air grew thick with perfume and pretense as nobles vied for the king's attention. "Your Highness must agree," simpered Lady Rothschild, her peacock-feathered fan fluttering, "that the Duke's new estate is simply magnificent." Leopold forced a polite smile. "Indeed." His gaze drifted to the frost-covered windows, beyond which real life continued without such tiresome ceremony. At the head of the table, King Wilhelm's voice cut through the chatter like steel. "The alliance with Bavaria grows stronger. Their princess would make a suitable match." Leopold's fingers tightened around his goblet. Always alliances, always arrangements, always the endless game of power and position. The hall seemed to close in around him, the air growing staler with each shallow breath. "If you'll excuse me," he murmured, rising from his chair. Several courtiers half rose in response, but he waved them down. "Please, continue. I merely need some air." In his chambers, Leopold traded his embroidered jacket and silk cravat for a plain wool cloak and sturdy boots. The simple garments felt like freedom against his skin. With practiced stealth, he slipped through the servants' passages and out into the winter night. Snow crunched beneath his feet as he made his way down the winding path toward the village. The clean, crisp air filled his lungs, washing away the cloying scents of the banquet. Smoke rose in lazy spirals from cottage chimneys, carrying the honest smell of wood-fire and cooking. Here was real life, unvarnished and true. As Leopold rounded a bend in the path, movement caught his eye. A young woman struggled through the snow, her arms laden with firewood. Her dress was simple wool, patched but clean, and her dark hair escaped in wisps from beneath a worn cap. Despite her burden, she moved with determination, adjusting the heavy load with quiet persistence. Something about her struck him, perhaps the quiet dignity in her bearing, or the way she pressed on without complaint. This was no pampered noble, wilting at the slightest discomfort. This was strength, real and unadorned. Leopold stepped back into the shadows of the trees, watching as she made her way along the snowy path. She paused once to shift the wood in her arms, and he caught a glimpse of her face in the moonlight. Though young, her features held a gentle wisdom that spoke of early responsibility. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and effort, but her eyes remained focused on her task. The woman turned off the main path, following a narrower trail that wound deeper into the woods. Leopold found himself following at a discreet distance, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't quite name. Each step took him further from the castle's artificial splendor and deeper into a world of simple truths. Through the trees, he could make out the warm glow of a cottage window. The woman's pace quickened slightly at the sight of home, though she was clearly weary from her burden. Leopold remained in the shelter of the forest, watching as she approached the humble dwelling. Here was a life untouched by the shallow pageantry of court, where worth was measured in honest work rather than empty titles. The prince stood motionless in the growing darkness, his world suddenly seeming smaller and less certain than it had mere hours before. The woman Valentina, he would later learn, disappeared into her cottage, but Leopold lingered in the shadows. The light from her window spilled across the snow, warm and welcoming, so different from the cold brilliance of the castle's chandeliers. For the first time in years, he felt truly awake, truly present in his own skin. Snow began to fall softly around him, but still he waited, pulled by something he couldn't yet understand. In that moment, watching the humble cottage and its remarkable inhabitant, Leopold felt the first stirring of a change that would shake his carefully ordered world to its very foundations. The cottage door creaked as Valentina pushed it open with her shoulder, carefully maneuvering the armload of firewood through the narrow entrance. The single room within glowed faintly from the dying embers in the hearth, barely enough light to see by. The familiar scent of herbs hung in the air, remedies she'd gathered in desperate hope. "Anthony?" she called softly, setting down the wood beside the hearth. A weak cough answered her from the straw bed in the corner. Outside the cottage's single window, Prince Leopold drew closer, peering through a crack in the wooden shutters. The humble interior startled him. One room, earthen floor, a few pieces of rough furniture, so different from the palace with its endless chambers and gilded furnishings. Valentina knelt beside the narrow bed where her brother lay. Anthony's face was pale in the dim light, his breathing labored. She pressed a gentle hand to his forehead, her touch full of tenderness. "Still warm?" she murmured, reaching for a damp cloth. "But not as bad as yesterday, thank the Lord." "Did you eat?" Anthony's voice was barely a whisper. "Of course," Valentina lied smoothly, though her stomach cramped with hunger. She tucked the thin blanket more securely around his shoulders. Leopold watched, transfixed, as she moved to a small wooden shelf. There sat a single piece of dark bread, clearly all that remained of their food. Valentina broke it carefully in half, then thought better and left it whole. "Here," she said, returning to Anthony's bedside. "You need your strength." But the boy started to protest. "Hush now. I had plenty at the market today." Another gentle lie, delivered with a smile that didn't quite hide her worry. From his vantage point, Leopold felt his chest tighten. He had never witnessed such selfless care. In the palace, even the servants ate better than this. Yet here was this young woman, choosing hunger for herself to nourish her sick brother. Valentina added wood to the fire, building it carefully to make the precious fuel last. Then she knelt beside Anthony's bed, clasping her hands, her whispered prayer carried clearly through the night air. "Dear Lord, I ask not for myself, but for him. Please, if it be your will, spare him this fever. He is all I have left in this world. I promise to serve you always, to help others as you have taught us. Only please, please let him live." Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. Anthony's thin hand reached for hers, and she gripped it tightly. Leopold found himself holding his breath, moved beyond words by the depth of faith in her simple prayer. In all his years of formal church services, of elaborate rituals and ceremonies, he had never heard such pure devotion. The night deepened around him as he watched Valentina tend her brother. She sang soft lullabies, changed the cool cloth on his forehead, and dozed fitfully beside him, while her own stomach surely ached with hunger. As false dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Leopold finally forced himself to leave. His legs were stiff from standing so long in the cold, but his heart was fuller than it had ever been. The image of Valentina kneeling in prayer stayed with him as he made his way back to the castle. In his chambers, Leopold paced restlessly, still wearing his rough peasant clothes. Though exhausted, he could not find sleep. Valentina's whispered prayer echoed in his mind. "Please, if it be your will." Her face, illuminated by firelight, haunted him, the mix of worry and hope, of strength and vulnerability. He had seen true nobility tonight, and it had nothing to do with titles or crowns. As morning light began to seep through his windows, Leopold made a silent vow. He would find a way to help them, this brave young woman and her ailing brother. Somehow, he would ease their burden without wounding their dignity. Finally, he sank into his bed, still dressed in wool and leather rather than his usual silk nightclothes. But sleep continued to elude him as Valentina's prayer played over and over in his thoughts, changing something fundamental in his heart. Morning sunlight streamed through the monastery's stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the stone floor. Prince Leopold strode through the quiet halls, his footsteps echoing in the peaceful silence. He found the friar in the herb garden, bent over rows of medicinal plants. "Good morrow, Your Highness," the friar said, straightening with a gentle smile. His brown robes were dusted with earth. "What brings you to our humble monastery so early?" Leopold glanced around to ensure their privacy. "I require your help, good friar, and your discretion." The friar's kind eyes studied the prince's face. "Of course, my lord, how may I serve?" "There is a cottage, near the woods," Leopold began, keeping his voice low. "A young woman lives there with her sick brother. They are in dire need, yet must not know the help comes from me." The friar nodded thoughtfully. "Ah, you speak of Valentina and young Anthony. Their plight is known to me." Leopold withdrew a small pouch from beneath his cloak. Inside were medicines from the castle physician's stores, along with coins he had wrapped in cloth to muffle their sound. "Please, take these to them, and this, as well." He produced a fresh loaf of bread, still warm from the castle kitchens. "A generous gift, Your Highness," the friar said softly. "But may I ask why the secrecy?" "Their dignity must remain intact," Leopold replied. "Let them believe it comes from the monastery's charity." The friar's eyes twinkled with understanding. "As you wish, my lord. God's blessings often arrive in mysterious ways." Later that morning, Valentina started at a knock on her cottage door. She opened it to find the kindly friar standing there, his arms full. "Good morning, my child," he said warmly. "I bring some small offerings from the monastery." Valentina's eyes filled with tears as she saw the medicine and bread. "Oh, Father," she whispered, "I was just praying for help. Surely God has heard me." The friar handed her the items, hiding his knowing smile. "The Lord works in his own way, my dear. How fares young Anthony today?" They turned to look at the boy, who stirred weakly in his bed. Valentina hurried to break off a piece of the fresh bread, soaking it in water to make broth. "Here, brother," she said softly, helping Anthony sit up. "Small sips now." The friar watched as she tenderly fed her brother, adding herbs from the medicine packet to strengthen the broth. Already, color seemed to be returning to Anthony's cheeks. "And God bless you, Father," Valentina said, her voice thick with emotion. "We had almost nothing left, I feared." She trailed off, unable to speak her deepest fears. "Give thanks to God, not to me," the friar replied gently. I am but his humble servant." He blessed them both before taking his leave, his heart warmed by the scene of renewed hope. Back at the castle, Leopold received the friar's report with quiet satisfaction. "The medicine was well received?" he asked, trying to mask his eager interest. "Indeed, Your Highness. The boy already shows signs of improvement, and his sister's prayers of gratitude were most touching." Leopold nodded, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. "Thank you, good friar. Your discretion in this matter will be absolute," the friar assured him with a respectful bow. That evening found Leopold seated at the grand dining table beside his father, the king. Platters of roasted meats and fine delicacies covered the polished surface, while courtiers dined and chatted. Leopold was lost in thoughts of the humble cottage when a conversation nearby caught his attention. "The southern woods would make an excellent hunting preserve," said Lord Blackwood, a wealthy nobleman. "Those peasant holdings are barely productive anyway." "Indeed," agreed another lord, washing down a bite of pheasant with expensive wine. "I've surveyed the area myself. A dozen cottages at most, easily cleared. The village has been there for generations," a third noble commented. "But I suppose progress cannot be stopped. When do you plan to begin?" Leopold's silver fork clattered against his plate, drawing sharp looks. Cold dread settled in his stomach as he realized they were speaking of Valentina's village. The very land that sheltered her cottage, the home she had made for her brother, would be stripped away for the pleasure of wealthy hunters. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles white with tension. Around him, the cheerful dinner conversation continued, but Leopold could no longer focus on the elaborate feast before him. All he could see was Valentina's face as she prayed by her brother's bedside, her faith pure and strong despite their poverty. The nobles continued discussing their plans, as if discussing the weather, while Leopold sat frozen in his chair, his mind racing with the implications of their cruel scheme. The winter morning dawned gray and bitter, as riders thundered into the village square, their horses' hooves churning the muddy snow. Valentina stood at her cottage door, watching as villagers gathered around the mounted men, their faces growing darker with each proclamation. "By order of Lord Blackwood," the lead rider announced, his voice cutting through the cold air, "additional taxes are hereby demanded from all households." He paused, unfurling a scroll. "Furthermore, the castle requires young women for kitchen service. The following must report by sundown." Valentina's heart stopped as her name echoed across the square. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. Behind her, Anthony stirred in his bed, still weak, but improving daily thanks to the mysterious gifts from the monastery. "Sister?" he called softly. "What's happening?" She turned to him, forcing a brave smile. "The castle needs workers, Anthony. I must go." His eyes widened with fear. "But you can't leave. Who will care for me?" "Hush now," she soothed. Though her own heart was breaking, the widow Miller has already offered to take you in. She's kind, and her cottage is warm. Tears spilled down Anthony's pale cheeks. "When will you return?" "As soon as I am able," Valentina promised, gathering him into her arms. "The castle isn't so very far. Perhaps I can visit on market days." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. The widow Miller arrived, her weathered face full of sympathy, helping Valentina pack Anthony's few belongings. Other selected girls hurried about the village, making similar arrangements with neighbors and family. When the time came to leave, Valentina knelt beside Anthony's bed one last time. "Be brave, little brother," she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Mind the widow Miller, take your medicine, and remember your prayers." "I will," he sniffled, clinging to her worn shawl. "Promise you won't forget me?" Never, she vowed fiercely. You are my heart, Anthony. Nothing could make me forget you. The journey to the castle seemed endless. Valentina walked with the other chosen girls, their small bundles clutched tight, breath frosting in the cold air. The castle loomed before them, its stone walls growing taller with each step, until they finally passed beneath the great arch into the servants' courtyard. A stern-faced housekeeper met them, distributing rough work dresses and worn aprons. You'll sleep in the servants' dormitory, she explained briskly. Work begins before dawn and ends after the last noble retires. Mind your manners, keep your eyes down, and remember your place. The kitchen was a chaos of heat, steam, and shouted orders. Valentina found herself assigned to the scullery, where mountains of pots and pans awaited scrubbing. Her hands, already rough from years of work, soon grew red and cracked from the harsh soap and hot water. She was bent over a particularly stubborn pot when a shadow fell across her work. Looking up, she met the concerned gaze of a young man in simple clothes. Something about his eyes seemed familiar, but she couldn't place where she might have seen him before. It was Leopold, carefully disguised in servant's garb, his heart aching at the sight of her laboring in these conditions. He wanted desperately to speak with her, to offer comfort, but fear of revealing his identity held him back. Instead, he merely nodded and hurried past, his chest tight with suppressed emotion. Night finally fell, bringing blessed quiet to the bustling castle. In the servants' dormitory, Valentina lay on her thin straw pallet, every muscle aching from the day's work. Around her, other girls sniffled softly, homesick for their families and familiar lives. The stone ceiling stretched above her, cold and gray in the darkness. Valentina clasped her hands over her heart, her lips moving in silent prayer. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "watch over my Anthony. Keep him safe and warm in the widow Miller's care. Give him strength to heal, and please, please let me see him again soon." A tear slid down her temple, disappearing into her hair. The strange bed felt wrong. The air smelled wrong. Everything about this place made her heart ache for her humble cottage. But she would endure. For Anthony, she would endure anything. The deep tolling of dawn bells echoed through the castle grounds, pulling Valentina from her restless sleep. Around her, other servant girls stirred on their straw pallets, some groaning softly as they rose to face another day of endless work. The kitchen already blazed with activity when Valentina arrived, her hair neatly tucked beneath a plain white cap. Steam rose from great copper pots while the head cook barked orders, her voice carrying over the clatter of pans and scraping of wooden spoons. "You there, girl," the cook called, pointing at Valentina. "The water barrels need filling, and those fires won't stoke themselves." Valentina grabbed 2 heavy wooden buckets and hurried toward the well in the servants' courtyard. The morning air bit at her cheeks, winter's chill still clinging to the shadows. As she approached the well, a figure emerged from the misty dawn, the same young man she'd noticed yesterday, dressed in simple brown clothing that somehow seemed too fine for a common servant. "Allow me to help," he offered, his voice gentle despite its obvious refinement. Before she could protest, he took the buckets from her hands. Valentina studied him curiously as he lowered the first bucket into the well. "You're most kind, sir, but surely you have your own duties to attend?" Leopold smiled, careful to maintain his disguise. "The cook sent me to assist where needed." The lie tasted bitter on his Seuss tongue, but he couldn't reveal his true identity. "I'm Thomas," he added, using the name of one of his childhood tutors. They worked together through the morning, Leopold carrying the heavier buckets, while Valentina directed him to where the water was needed. Other servants cast questioning glances their way. It was unusual to see a male servant helping in the kitchens, but none dared comment. As Valentina kneaded bread at a wooden table, flour dusting her forearms, she found herself opening up to this kind stranger. "My brother, Anthony, he's only just recovering from a terrible fever," she confided. "God sent us help through the monastery. Medicine and food arrived just when we needed it most." Leopold's heart warmed, knowing he had been the source of that aid. "Your faith seems very strong," he observed, passing her more flour. "'Tis all I have sometimes," she admitted, her hands working the dough with practiced skill. "In our village, we may lack fine things, but we have community, prayer, and hope. Even now, separated from Anthony, I trust that God has a purpose for bringing me here." Throughout the day, Leopold found excuses to stay near her, helping where he could while drinking in her words. She spoke of village life, with such genuine warmth, of harvest festivals, where everyone shared what little they had, of neighbors helping neighbors through hard times, of simple pleasures like fresh bread and clean sunshine. As evening approached, Valentina finished her last tasks, her shoulders aching from the day's labor. Leopold, who had never left her side for long, noticed her exhaustion. "Allow me to walk you to the dormitory," he offered. "The corridors can be confusing in the dark." They walked slowly through the torchlit passages, their footsteps echoing off stone walls. Valentina's hand swung gently at her side as she walked, and for one brief moment, it brushed against Leopold's. A jolt of awareness passed between them at the innocent contact, and both quickly looked away, hearts beating faster. At the dormitory entrance, Valentina turned to him with a tired smile. "Thank you for your kindness today, Thomas. It means more than you know." Leopold bowed slightly, fighting the urge to take her hand properly in his. "The pleasure was mine," he replied softly. "Rest well, Valentina." He watched her disappear into the dormitory, the memory of their brief touch burning in his mind. In that simple moment of connection, something had shifted between them, something that both thrilled and terrified him. For the first time in his life, Leopold understood what it meant to care for someone beyond duty or station. Winter winds howled outside the castle walls, but inside, warmth and excitement filled every corridor. The grand feast day had arrived, and servants scurried through passageways like mice, their arms laden with decorations and dishes. In the vast kitchen, Valentina's fingers ached, from polishing silver goblets until they gleamed like mirrors. Around her, other maids wove pine and holly into elaborate garlands, their hands sticky with sap. The air grew thick with the sweet scent of baking pies, apple, pear, and quince, their golden crusts bubbling in the huge stone ovens. "Mind you don't miss a spot," the head cook warned, inspecting each piece of silverware with sharp eyes. "The nobility will notice every smudge." Valentina nodded, rubbing harder at a stubborn tarnish mark. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, the kind servant who had helped her these past days. She hadn't seen him since yesterday, and the kitchen felt emptier without his gentle presence. As evening approached, the head housekeeper swept into the kitchen, her keys jangling at her waist. You, and you," she pointed, selecting servants for various tasks. Her finger landed on Valentina. "You'll serve wine in the great hall." Valentina's heart jumped into her throat. She had never served at a noble gathering before. "But madam, No arguments. Wash your face and put on a clean apron, and for heaven's sake, tuck those wisps of hair under your cap properly." Soon Valentina found herself holding a heavy silver pitcher of deep red wine, waiting with other servants in a small antechamber. Through the thick wooden doors, she could hear the murmur of noble voices and the scraping of chairs. "Remember," the housekeeper whispered fiercely, "eyes down, move quietly, and never speak unless spoken to directly." The doors swung open, and Valentina followed the other servers into the great hall. Hundreds of candles blazed in iron chandeliers, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. Rich tapestries hung between tall windows, and the air smelled of roasted meat and pine boughs. Keeping her eyes lowered as instructed, Valentina moved carefully between the tables, refilling goblets when noble hands raised them in silent request. Her arms trembled slightly from the weight of the pitcher, but she forced herself to move steadily, praying she wouldn't spill a drop. As she approached the high table on the dais, curiosity finally overcame her training. She allowed herself one quick glance upward, and her world tilted on its axis. There, seated in a carved wooden throne, sat Thomas. Except he wasn't Thomas at all. He wore deep blue velvet, trimmed with gold, a delicate crown of silver and sapphires resting on his dark hair. His bearing was regal, his expression composed as he listened to an elderly nobleman speaking beside him, Prince Leopold. The kind servant who had carried water, lifted heavy buckets, and walked her to her dormitory was the crown prince himself. The wine pitcher shook dangerously in Valentina's hands. She felt the blood drain from her face, as memories rushed through her mind, all the things she had said to him, the way she had spoken so freely of her life, her brother, her hopes, how he must have laughed at her simplicity. But then Leopold's eyes met hers, and what she saw there wasn't mockery at all. His gaze held the same gentleness she had come to know, mixed now with something like pleading. He gave her the smallest shake of his head, as if begging her not to draw attention to their shared secret. Valentina forced her trembling hands to steady. She was a servant, and she had a task to complete. Carefully, she stepped forward and refilled the goblets at the high table, including Leopold's. She kept her face carefully blank, though her heart pounded so hard she feared others might hear it. When she reached Leopold's place, she dared one more glance at his face. His expression was soft, almost sad, as if he feared what she must think of him now. In that moment, Valentina understood that whatever game he had played at being a servant, his kindness had been real. She gave him the slightest of nods, acknowledgement, not forgiveness, not yet, and continued her duties, moving down the table with measured steps, the wine steady in her hands. The feast continued long into the night. Musicians in the gallery above played soft melodies on lutes and viols, while servants cleared away the remnants of the meal. Noble couples rose to dance, their silk shoes whispering across the stone floor, jewels glinting in the candlelight. Prince Leopold remained at the high table, his food barely touched. His eyes kept straying to Valentina as she moved among the guests with her wine pitcher. Each time their gazes met, both quickly looked away, but not quickly enough to escape notice. Lady Isolde, resplendent in emerald silk, watched these exchanges with growing fury. She had spent months carefully cultivating the prince's attention, only to see him captivated by a common serving girl. Her fingers tightened around her goblet, as she observed Leopold's gentle expression whenever Valentina passed near. "Did you see that?" she whispered loudly to her companion. "The way he looks at her? It's unseemly." The whispers spread through the hall like wildfire. Noble heads turned to watch, eyes narrowing as they noticed what Lady Isolde had pointed out. The prince's attention to a mere kitchen maid was indeed shocking, unprecedented. Leopold seemed oblivious to the growing tension, his eyes following Valentina's graceful movements. When she approached to refill his goblet, his hand moved slightly, as if to touch hers, before he caught himself. That small gesture was all Lady Isolde needed. She rose from her seat, her voice cutting through the music like a blade. "Your Majesty," she called out to King Wilhelm, "I must bring to your attention a grave matter of impropriety." The musicians faltered. Dancers stopped mid-step. All eyes turned to Lady Isolde as she pointed an accusing finger at Valentina, who stood frozen with the wine pitcher clutched to her chest. "This serving girl has been shamelessly attempting to seduce the prince. I have watched her all evening, making eyes at him, trying to draw his attention. No doubt she hopes to rise above her station through such disgraceful means." Gasps echoed through the hall. King Wilhelm's face darkened with anger as he turned to study the scene before him. Two guards immediately moved forward, roughly grabbing Valentina's arms. The wine pitcher crashed to the floor, spreading like blood across the stones. "No!" Leopold stood so quickly, his chair toppled backward. "This is madness. She has done nothing wrong." He moved to step down from the dais, but his advisors quickly surrounded him, holding him back. "Your Highness," one whispered urgently, "you must not involve yourself. Think of the scandal." "Father," Leopold called out, struggling against the restraining hands, "I beg you to listen." But King Wilhelm raised his hand for silence. His cold eyes fixed on Valentina, who stood straight, despite the guard's tight grip on her arms. "Such behavior cannot be tolerated," he declared. "The girl will be confined to the castle cellars until we can determine the full extent of her manipulation." Lady Isolde's triumphant smile gleamed in the candlelight. Around the hall, nobles nodded in approval of the king's swift justice, though a few looked uncomfortable at the scene unfolding before them. The guards produced iron manacles, their clinking sound sharp in the tense silence. As they fastened them around Valentina's wrists, she neither struggled nor begged. Instead, she lifted her face toward the vaulted ceiling, her lips moving in silent prayer. Leopold watched in helpless anguish as the guards began to lead her away. Their eyes met one final time across the hall. In that moment, despite her chains, Valentina's gaze held no blame, only a quiet dignity that made her seem more noble than any of the richly dressed lords and ladies who watched her pass. "Take her to the cellars," King Wilhelm commanded. "She will await judgment there." The guards marched Valentina toward the great doors, her chains rattling against the stone floor. Even as she disappeared from view, her head remained high, her faith apparently unshaken by this sudden fall from grace. The musicians hesitantly resumed playing, but the festive mood of the feast had shattered like the fallen wine pitcher. Leopold sank back into his chair, his face a mask of barely contained emotion, while Lady Isolde watched him with calculating eyes. In the corner, servants whispered prayers for their friend, now imprisoned below in the cold and darkness of the castle cellars. In the castle's deepest cellars, darkness pressed close like a heavy blanket. Valentina knelt on the damp stone floor, her thin servant's dress offering little protection against the chill. Iron chains clinked softly as she clasped her hands in prayer, her whispered words creating small clouds in the cold air. "Dear Lord, grant me strength," she murmured, her voice steady despite her circumstances. "Watch over Anthony, keep him safe." Her brother's face filled her thoughts, his gentle smile, his trusting eyes. Tears threatened, but she blinked them away. "Just let me see him once more, I beg you." A torch flickered in the corridor outside, casting dancing shadows through the iron bars of her cell. The guard shifted, uncomfortable with her constant prayers, yet moved by their sincerity. Above, in the castle proper, servants hurried through torch-lit corridors, their whispers spreading like autumn leaves in the wind. "Did you hear about Valentina?" they asked one another. She's never been anything but kind to everyone. Remember how she stayed up all night nursing Mary's baby? One kitchen maid recalled. Or how she always shares her bread with the stable boys? The cook's helper nodded vigorously. And she never complains, no matter how hard the work. It's not right, what they're saying about her. Their quiet rebellion spread through the castle's lower levels, a current of support for one of their own. Even those who had known her only briefly spoke of her gentle nature and unwavering faith. Meanwhile, in the village, Anthony stood at the window of his neighbor's cottage, his breaths coming easier now, thanks to the mysterious medicine. The moon illuminated his determined young face as he turned to the gathered villagers. "We must help my sister," he declared, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "She's all I have, and she's innocent." The neighbors, simple folk who had watched Valentina sacrifice everything for her brother, nodded in agreement. They had seen her struggle, her devotion, her unshakable faith. They knew the truth of her character. "I'll fetch the friar," old Thomas offered, pulling on his worn cloak. "He brought the medicine that saved you, lad. He'll know what to say to the nobles." The night air bit cold as Thomas hurried toward the monastery. The friar was awake, as if expecting the summons. His eyes were kind but worried as he listened to Thomas's breathless explanation. "Yes," he said finally, reaching for his own cloak. "I will speak of what I know. The truth must be told." Soon, a small group assembled. Anthony, supported by his neighbors, the friar, clutching his prayer beads, and several villagers who had known Valentina since childhood. They set out for the castle, their determination warming them against the winter night. The castle loomed before them, its towers black against the star-filled sky. Guards at the gate crossed their spears, but the friar stepped forward. "We come with testimony for the king's council," he announced firmly, regarding the servant girl, Valentina. In the great hall, preparations were already underway for the dawn council. Servants hung extra torches in iron brackets, while nobles gathered in small groups, discussing the scandal in hushed voices. King Wilhelm sat upon his throne, his face stern as advisors bent to whisper in his ear. Lady Isolde stood to one side, her emerald dress now changed for a more somber gown of midnight blue. Her smile was subtle, but satisfied, as she watched Prince Leopold's obvious distress. The prince paced near his father's throne, unable to hide his concern. "Father," he tried again, "surely there's no need for such harsh." "Silence," the king commanded. "We will hear the evidence at dawn, as proper procedure demands." His voice softened slightly at his son's obvious pain. "Justice will be served, Leopold. One way or another." Torches sputtered and crackled, their light catching the rich tapestries on the walls. Guards took their positions around the hall's perimeter, while scribes prepared their quills and parchment. The hour of judgment approached with the inevitability of the rising Sunday. In her cell, Valentina continued her prayers, unaware of the forces gathering above to determine her fate. Her faith remained unshaken, her spirit unbowed by the cold stones and heavy chains. She waited for dawn, trusting in a higher justice than that of mortal kings. Dawn crept through the castle windows, painting the great hall in pale gold. Guards led Valentina forward, chains clinking against the marble floor. Though her dress was wrinkled and her hair disheveled from the night in the cellar, she held her head high, eyes clear with unwavering faith. Lady Isolde stepped forward, her midnight blue gown rustling. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "This servant girl has bewitched our beloved prince. I saw her scheming, watching him, planning to rise above her station." Whispers rippled through the gathered nobles, like wind through wheat. Ladies behind painted fans exchanged knowing glances, while lords nodded gravely at such impropriety. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors burst open. Anthony stumbled in, supported by village neighbors. Though still pale and thin, his eyes blazed with determination. Behind him stood the friar, his brown robes dusty from travel. "Stop," Anthony called out, his voice breaking with a cough. "My sister is innocent." The friar stepped forward, bowing to the king. "Your Majesty, I bring truth. It was Prince Leopold himself who sent medicine and bread to save this boy's life through my hands. I witnessed his charity, done in secret." A hush fell over the hall. Even the torches seemed to still their dancing. Lady Isolda's face drained of color as Leopold strode forward, shrugging off his advisor's restraining hands. "Father," Leopold declared, his voice ringing clear through the silent hall, "I disguised myself as a servant and followed Valentina that winter night. In her humble hut, I witnessed nobility greater than any I have seen in this court. I saw a sister sacrifice her last morsel for her brother, heard prayers of gratitude even in deepest poverty." The king leaned forward on his throne, his crown glinting in the morning light. "Son, consider your words carefully." Leopold stood taller, his gaze steady. "If such love pure, selfless and true is beneath a crown," he proclaimed, "then I am unworthy of it." Gasps echoed off the stone walls. Ladies clutched their pearls while lords muttered in shock. Lady Isolde swayed, her face ashen, as the truth of her schemes crumbled before the prince's declaration. King Wilhelm rose from his throne, his face softening as he gazed at his son. He raised his hand, and the murmuring nobles fell silent. The morning light streamed through the high windows, casting a golden glow across the great hall. "In all my years upon this throne," the king's voice resonated, "I have judged nobility by birthright alone. Yet before me stands a maiden whose faith and virtue shine brighter than any coronet." He descended the steps, his crimson robes sweeping the marble floor. "Valentina, your devotion to your brother, your unwavering faith, and your humble dignity have taught this court the true meaning of nobility." The guard stepped forward, removing Valentina's chains. Lady Isolde, her face ashen, backed away as whispers of her schemes spread through the crowd. "Furthermore," the king continued, "the village lands shall be restored to their rightful tenants, and young Anthony shall be placed under our royal protection, with the finest physicians to attend him." Tears of joy streamed down Valentina's cheeks as Anthony rushed to embrace her. Leopold stepped forward, taking her hand before the entire court. 3 weeks passed, and on 3 successive Sundays, the chapel bells rang out as the banns were read. Though some courtiers still whispered behind their fans, most had been won over by Valentina's gentle nature and Leopold's unwavering devotion. On her wedding day, Valentina walked down the chapel aisle, not as a peasant girl elevated beyond her station, but as a woman whose pure heart had transformed an entire court. Her simple white gown gleamed in the sunlight that poured through the stained glass windows. Leopold waited at the altar, his eyes filled with love and pride. "I pledge thee my honor and fidelity." Leopold's voice rang clear through the chapel as he slipped the ring upon her finger. "Not just as my princess, but as the keeper of my heart." As spring dawned over the kingdom, the newly wedded couple stood in the castle gardens with Anthony. Cherry blossoms drifted on the breeze like snow, and children's laughter echoed from the courtyard below. The chapel bells rang out across the valley, their joyous peals carrying to the farthest village. Valentina gazed at her brother, now healthy and strong, then at her beloved Leopold. "God heard after all," she whispered, her heart full of gratitude. Leopold raised her hand to his lips. placing a gentle kiss upon it. Together, they walked forward along the garden path, their hearts united in faith, hope, and love, while the spring breeze carried the promise of new beginnings. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.